This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. Don Quixote, Volume 1 by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Part 15. Chapters 44 and 45. Chapter 44, in which are continued the unheard-of adventures of the inn. So loud, in fact, were the shouts of Don Quixote, that the landlord, opening the gate of the inn in all haste, came out in dismay, and ran to see who was uttering such cries, and those who were outside joined him. Maritornes, who had been by this time roused up by the same outcry, suspecting what it was, ran to the loft, and, without any one seeing her, untied the halter by which Don Quixote was suspended, and down he came to the ground, in the sight of the landlord and the travellers, who, approaching, asked him what was the matter with him that he shouted so. He, without replying a word, took the rope off his wrist, and rising to his feet, leaped upon Rocinante, braced his buckler on his arm, put his lance in rest, and made a considerable circuit of the plain, came back at a half gallop, exclaiming, "Whoever shall say that I have been enchanted, with just cause, provided my lady the princess Micomicona grant me permission to do so, I give him the lie, challenge him, and defy him to single combat." The newly arrived travellers were amazed at the words of Don Quixote, but the landlord removed their surprise by telling them who he was, and not to mind him, as he was out of his senses. They then asked the landlord if, by any chance, a youth of about 15 years of age had come to that inn, one dressed like a muleteer, and of such and such an appearance, describing that of Donna Clara's lover. The landlord replied that there were so many people in the inn, he had not noticed the person they were inquiring for. But one of them, observing the coach in which the judge had come, said, "He is here, no doubt, for this is the coach he is following. Let one of us stay at the gate, and the rest go in to look for him. Or indeed it would be as well if one of us went round the inn, lest he should escape over the wall of the yard." "So be it," said another. And while two of them went in, one remained at the gate, and the other made the circuit of the inn. Observing all which, the landlord was unable to conjecture for what reason they were taking all these precautions, though he understood they were looking for the youth whose description they had given him. It was by this time broad daylight, and for that reason, as well as in consequence of the noise Don Quixote had made, everybody was awake and up, but particularly Donna Clara and Dorothea, for they had been able to sleep but badly that night, the one from agitation at having her lover so near her, the other from curiosity to see him. Don Quixote, when he saw that not one of the four travellers took any notice of him, or replied to his challenge, was furious and ready to die with indignation and wrath. And if he could have found in the ordinances of chivalry that it was lawful for a knight-errant to undertake or engage in another enterprise, when he had plighted his word and faith not to involve himself in any until he had made an end of the one to which he was pledged, he would have attacked the whole of them, and would have made them return an answer in spite of themselves. But, considering that it would not become him, nor be right, to begin any new enterprise until he had established Micomicona in her kingdom, he was constrained to hold his peace, and wait quietly to see what would be the upshot of the proceedings of these same travellers, one of whom found the youth they were seeking lying asleep by the side of a muleteer, without a thought of any one coming in search of him, much less finding him. The man laid hold of him by the arm, saying, "It becomes you well indeed, Señor Don Luis, to be in the dress you wear, and well the bed in which I find you agrees with the luxury in which your mother reared you." The youth rubbed his sleepy eyes, and stared for a while at him who held him, but presently recognised him as one of his father's servants, at which he was so taken aback that for some time he could not find or utter a word, while the servant went on to say, "There is nothing for it now, Señor Don Luis, but to submit quietly and return home, unless it is your wish that my lord, your father, should take his departure for the other world, for nothing else can be the consequence of the grief he is in at your absence." "But how did my father know that I had gone this road, and in this dress?" said Don Luis. "It was a student to whom you confided your intentions," answered the servant, "that disclosed them. Touched with pity at the distress he saw your father in on missing you, he therefore dispatched 4 of his servants in quest of you, and here we all are at your service, better pleased than you can imagine that we shall return so soon, and be able to restore you to those eyes that so yearn for you." "That shall be as I please, or as heaven orders," returned Don Luis. "What can you please, or heaven order," said the other, "except agree to go back? Anything else is impossible." All this conversation between the two was overheard by the muleteer, at whose side Don Luis lay, and rising, he went to report what had taken place to Don Fernando, Cardenio, and the others, who had by this time dressed themselves, and told them how the man had addressed the youth as Don, and what words had passed, and how he wanted him to return to his father, which the youth was unwilling to do. With this, and what they already knew of the rare voice that heaven had bestowed upon him, they all felt very anxious to know more, particularly who he was, and even to help him if it was attempted to employ force against him. So they hastened to where he was still talking and arguing with his servant. Dorothea at this instant came out of her room, followed by Dona Clara, all in a tremor, and calling Cardenio aside, she told him in a few words the story of the musician and Dona Clara, and he at the same time told her what had happened, how his father's servants had come in search of him. But in telling her so, he did not speak low enough, but that Dona Clara heard what he said, at which she was so much agitated that had not Dorothea hastened to support her, she would have fallen to the ground. Cardenio then bade Dorothea return to her room, as he would endeavour to make the whole matter right, and they did as he desired. All the 4 who had come in quest of Don Luis had now come into the inn, and surrounded him, urging him to return and console his father at once and without a moment's delay. He replied that he could not do so on any account until he had concluded some business in which his life, honour, and heart were at stake. The servants pressed him, saying that most certainly they would not return without him, and that they would take him away whether he liked it or not. "You shall not do that," replied Don Luis, "unless you take me dead, though however you take me, it will be without life." By this time most of those in the inn had been attracted by the dispute, but particularly Cardenio, Don Fernando, his companions, the judge, the curate, the barber, and Don Quixote, for he now considered there was no necessity for mounting guard over the castle any longer. Cardenio, being already acquainted with the young man's story, asked the men who wanted to take him away what object they had in seeking to carry off this youth against his will. "Our object," said one of the 4, "is to save the life of his father, who is in danger of losing it through this gentleman's disappearance." Upon this Don Luis exclaimed, "There is no need to make my affairs public here. I am free, and I will return if I please, and if not, none of you shall compel me." "Reason will compel your worship," said the man, "and if it has no power over you, it has power over us, to make us do what we came for, and what it is our duty to do." "Let us hear what the whole affair is about," said the judge at this. But the man, who knew him as a neighbour of theirs, replied, "Do you not know this gentleman, señor judge? He is the son of your neighbour, who has run away from his father's house in a dress so unbecoming his rank, as your worship may perceive." The judge, on this, looked at him more carefully, and recognised him, and embracing him said, "What folly is this, Señor Don Luis? Or what can have been the cause that could have induced you to come here in this way, and in this dress, which so ill becomes your condition?" Tears came into the eyes of the young man, and he was unable to utter a word in reply to the judge, who told the 4 servants not to be uneasy, for all would be satisfactorily settled. And then, taking Don Luis by the hand, he drew him aside and asked the reason of his having come there. But while he was questioning him they heard a loud outcry at the gate of the inn, the cause of which was that 2 of the guests who had passed the night there, seeing everybody busy about finding out what it was the 4 men wanted, had conceived the idea of going off without paying what they owed. But the landlord, who minded his own affairs more than other people's, caught them going out of the gate, and demanded his reckoning, abusing them for their dishonesty with such language that he drove them to reply with their fists, and so they began to lay on him in such a style that the poor man was forced to cry out and call for help. The landlady and her daughter could see no one more free to give aid than Don Quixote, and to him the daughter said, "Sir Knight, by the virtue God has given you, help my poor father, for 2 wicked men are beating him to a mummy." To which Don Quixote, very deliberately and phlegmatically, replied, "Fair damsel, at the present moment your request is inopportune, for I am debarred from involving myself in any adventure, until I have brought to a happy conclusion one to which my world has pledged me. But that which I can do for you is what I will now mention. Run, and tell your father to stand his ground as well as he can in this battle, and on no account to allow himself to be vanquished, while I go and request permission of the Princess Micomicona to enable me to succour him in his distress, and if she grants it, rest assured I will relieve him from it." "Sinner that I am," exclaimed Maritornes, who stood by, "before you have got your permission my master will be in the other world." "Give me leave, señora, to obtain the permission I speak of," returned Don Quixote, "and if I get it, it will matter very little if he is in the other world, for I will rescue him thence in spite of all the same world can do. Or, at any rate, I will give you such a revenge over those who have sent him there that you will be more than moderately satisfied." And without saying anything more, he went and knelt before Dorothea, requesting her highness in knightly and errant phrase to be pleased to grant him permission to aid and succour the castellan of the castle, who now stood in grievous jeopardy. The princess granted it graciously, and he at once, bracing his buckler on his arm and drawing his sword, hastened to the inn gate, where the 2 guests were still handling the landlord roughly. But as soon as he reached the spot he stopped short and stood still. The Maritornes and the landlady asked him why he hesitated to help their master and husband. "I hesitate," said Don Quixote, "because it is not lawful for me to draw sword against persons of squirely condition. But call my squire Sancho to me, for this defence and vengeance are his affair and business." Thus matters stood at the inn gate, where there was a very lively exchange of fisticuffs and punches, to the sore damage of the landlord, and to the wrath of Maritornes, the landlady, and her daughter, who were furious when they saw the pusillanimity of Don Quixote, and the hard treatment of their master, husband, and father was undergoing. But let us leave him there, for he will surely find some one to help him, and if not, let him suffer and hold his tongue who attempts more than his strength allows him to do. And let us go back 50 paces to see what Don Luis said in reply to the judge, whom we left questioning him privately as to the reasons for coming on foot and so meanly dressed. To which the youth, pressing his hand in a way that showed his heart was troubled by some great sorrow, and shedding a flood of tears, made answer, "Señor, I have no more to tell you than that from the moment when, through heaven's will and our being near neighbours, I first saw Dona Clara, your daughter, and my lady, from that instant I made her the mistress of my will, and if yours, my true lord and father, offers no impediment, this very day she shall become my wife. For her I left my father's house, and for her I assumed this disguise, to follow her whithersoever she may go, as the arrow seeks its mark, or the sailor the pole star. She knows nothing more of my passion than what she may have learnt from having sometimes seen me from a distance, that my eyes were filled with tears. You know already, señor, the wealth and noble birth of my parents, and that I am the sole heir. If this be a sufficient inducement for you to venture to make me completely happy, accept me at once as your son. For if my father, influenced by other objects of his own, should disapprove of this happiness I have sought for myself, time has more power to alter and change things than human will." With this the love-smitten youth was silent, while the judge, after hearing him, was astonished, perplexed, and surprised, as well at the manner and intelligence with which Don Luis had confessed the secret of his heart, as at the position in which he found himself, not knowing what course to take in the matter so sudden and unexpected. All the answer, therefore, he gave him was to bid him to make his mind easy for the present, and arrange with his servants not to take him back that day, so that there might be time to consider what was best for all parties. Don Luis kissed his hands by force, nay, bathed them with his tears, in a way that would have touched the heart of marble, not to say that of the judge, who, as a shrewd man, had already perceived how advantageous the marriage would be to his daughter, though, were it possible, he would have preferred that it should be brought about with the consent of the father of Don Luis, who he knew looked for a title for his son. The guests had by this time made peace with the landlord, for by persuasion and by Don Quixote's fair words more than by threats, they paid him what he demanded, and the servants of Don Luis were waiting for the end of the conversation with the judge and their master's decision, when the devil, who never sleeps, contrived that the barber, for whom Don Quixote had taken Mambrino's helmet, and Sancho Panza the trappings of his ass in exchange for those of his own, should at this instant enter the inn, which said barber, as he led his ass to the stable, observed Sancho Panza engaged in repairing something or other belonging to the pack-saddle, and the moment he saw it he knew it, and made bold to attack Sancho, exclaiming, "Ho, sir thief, I have caught you. Hand over my basin and my pack-saddle, and all my trappings that you robbed me of." Sancho, finding himself so unexpectedly assailed, and hearing the abuse poured upon him, seized the pack-saddle with one hand, and with the other gave the barber a cuff that bathed his teeth in blood. The barber, however, was not so ready to relinquish the prize he had made in the pack-saddle. On the contrary, he raised such an outcry that everyone in the inn came running to know what the noise and quarrel meant. "Here, in the name of the king and justice," he cried, "this thief and highwayman wants to kill me for trying to recover my property." "You lie," said Sancho, "I am no highwayman. It was in fair war my master Don Quixote won these spoils." Don Quixote was standing by at this time, highly pleased to see his squire's stoutness, both offensive and defensive, and from that time forth he reckoned him a man of mettle, and in his heart resolved to dub him a knight on the first opportunity that presented itself, feeling sure that the order of chivalry would be fittingly bestowed upon him. In the course of the altercation, among other things the barber said, "Gentlemen, this pack-saddle is mine as surely as I owe God a death, and I know it as well as if I had given birth to it, and here is my ass in the stable who will not let me lie. Only try it, and if it does not fit him like a glove, call me a rascal. And what is more, the same day I was robbed of this, they robbed me likewise of a new brass basin, never yet hand-selled, that would fetch a crown any day." At this Don Quixote could not keep himself from answering, and interposing between the two, and separating them, he placed the pack-saddle on the ground, to lie there in sight until the truth was established, and said, "Your worships may perceive clearly and plainly the error under which this worthy squire lies, when he calls a basin which was, is, and shall be the helmet of Mambrino, which I won from him in air war, I made myself master of by legitimate and lawful possession. With the pack-saddle I do not concern myself, but I may tell you on that head that my squire Sancho asked my permission to strip off the caparison of this vanquished poltroon's steed, and with it adorned his own. I allowed him, and he took it. And as to having its been changed from a caparison into a pack-saddle, I can give no explanation except the usual one, that such transformations will take place in adventures of chivalry. To confirm all which, run, Sancho my son, and fetch hither the helmet which this good fellow calls a basin. Egad, master, said Sancho, if we have no other proof of our case than that your worship puts forward, Mambrino's helmet is just as much a basin as this good fellow's caparison is a pack-saddle. Do as I bid thee, said Don Quixote. It cannot be that everything in this castle goes by enchantment. Sancho hastened to where the basin was, and brought it back with him. And when Don Quixote saw it, he took hold of it and said, Your worships may see with what a face this squire can assert that this is a basin and not the helmet I told you of. And I swear by the order of chivalry I profess, that this helmet is the identical one I took from him, without anything added to or taken from it. There is no doubt of that, said Sancho, for from the time my master won it until now he has only fought one battle in it, when he let loose those unlucky men in chains. And if it had not been for this basin helmet, he would not have come off over well that time, for there was plenty of stone throwing in the affair. Chapter 45, in which the doubtful question of Mambrino's helmet and the pack-saddle is finally settled, with other adventures that occurred in truth and earnest. What do you think now, gentlemen, said the barber, of what these gentles say, when they want to make out that this is a helmet? And whoever says the contrary, said Don Quixote, I will let him know he lies if he is a knight, and if he is a squire that he lies again 1,000 times. Our owner barber, who was present at this, and understood Don Quixote's humour so thoroughly, that it took into his head to back up his delusion, and carry on the joke for the general amusement. So addressing the other barber, he said, Señor barber, or whatever you are, you must know that I belong to your profession too, and have had a license to practise for more than 20 years, and I know the implements of the barber-craft, every one of them, perfectly well. And I was likewise a soldier from some time in the days of my youth, and I know also what a helmet is, and a morion, and a headpiece with a visor, and other things pertaining to soldiering. I meant to say to soldiers' arms, and I say, saving better opinions and always with submission to sounder judgments, that this piece we now have before us, which this worthy gentleman has in his hands, not only is no barber's basin, but it is far from being one as white is from black, and truth from falsehood. I say moreover that this, although it is a helmet, is not a complete helmet. Certainly not, said Don Quixote, for half of it is wanting, that is to say the beaver. It is quite true, said the curate, who saw the object of his friend the barber, and Cardenio, Don Fernando, and his companions agreed with him, and even the judge, if his thoughts had not been so full of Don Lewis's affair, would have helped to carry on the joke. But he was so taken up with the serious matters he had on his mind, that he paid little or no attention to these facetious proceedings. God bless me, exclaimed their butt the barber at this, is it possible that such an honourable company can say that this is not a basin but a helmet? Why, this is a thing that would astonish a whole university, however wise it might be. That will do. If this basin is a helmet, why, then the pack-saddle must be a horse's capstan, as the gentleman has said. To me it looks like a pack-saddle, said Don Quixote, but I have already said that with that question I do not concern myself. As to whether it be pack-saddle or caparison, said the curate, it is only for Señor Don Quixote to say, for in these matters of chivalry all these gentlemen and I bow to his authority. By God, gentlemen, said Don Quixote, So many strange things have happened to me in this castle, on the 2 occasions on which I have sojourned in it, that I will not venture to assert anything positively in reply to any question touching anything it contains. For it is my belief that everything that goes on within it goes by enchantment. The first time, an enchanted Moor that there is in it gave me sore trouble, nor did Sancho fare well among certain followers of his. And last night I was kept hanging by this arm for nearly 2 hours, without knowing how or why I came by such a mishap. So that now, for me to come forward to give an opinion in such a puzzling matter would be to risk a rash decision. As regards the assertion that this is a basin and not a helmet, I have already given an answer. But as to the question whether this is a pack-saddle or a caparison, I will not venture to give a positive opinion, but will leave it to your worship's better judgment. Perhaps, as you are not dubbed knights like myself, the enchantments of this place have nothing to do with you, and your faculties are unfettered, and you can see things in this castle as they really and truly are, and not as they appear to me." "There can be no question," said Don Fernando on this, "but that Señor Don Quixote has spoken very wisely, and that with us rests the decision of this matter, and that we may have surer ground to go on. I will take the votes of the gentlemen in secret, and declare the result clearly and fully." To those who were in the secret of Don Quixote's humour, all this afforded great amusement; but to those who knew nothing about it, it seemed the greatest nonsense in the world; in particular to the 4 servants of Don Luis, as well as to Don Luis himself, and to 3 other travellers who had by chance come to the inn, and had the appearance of officers of the Holy Brotherhood, as indeed they were. But the one who above all was at his wits' end was the barber Basin. There before his very eyes had been turned into Mambrino's helmet, and whose pack-saddle he had no doubt whatever was about to become a rich caparison for a horse. All laughed to see Don Fernando going from one to another, collecting the votes, and whispering to them to give him their private opinion, whether the treasure over which they had been so much fighting was a pack-saddle or a caparison. But after he had taken the votes of those who knew Don Quixote, he said aloud, "The fact is, my good fellow, that I am tired collecting such a number of opinions, for I find that there is not one of whom I ask what I desire to know, who does not tell me that it is absurd to say that this is a pack-saddle of an ass, and not the caparison of a horse, nay, of a thoroughbred horse. So you must submit, for in spite of you and your ass, this is a caparison and no pack-saddle, and you have stated and proved your case very badly." "May I never share heaven," said the poor barber, "if your worships are not all mistaken, and may my soul appear before God as that appears to me a pack-saddle, and not a caparison. But laws go, I say no more, and indeed I am not drunk, for I am fasting, except it be from sin." The simple talk of the barber did not afford less amusement than the absurdities of Don Quixote, who now observed, "There is no more to be done now than for each to take what belongs to him, and to whom God has given it, may St. Peter add his blessing." "But," said one of the 4 servants, "unless indeed this is a deliberate joke, I cannot bring myself to believe that men so intelligent as those present are, or seem to be, can venture to declare and assert that this is not a basin, and that not a pack-saddle. But as I perceive that they do assert and declare it, I can only come to the conclusion that there is some mystery in this persistence in what is so opposed to the evidence of experience and truth itself. For I swear by," and here he rapped out a round oath, "all the people in the world would not make me believe that that is not a barber's basin, and that a jackass's pack-saddle." "It might easily be a she-ass's," observed the curate. "It is all the same," said the servant. "That is not the point, but whether it is or is not a pack-saddle, as your worships say." On hearing this, one of the newly arrived officers of the Brotherhood, who had been listening to this dispute and controversy, unable to restrain his anger and impatient, exclaimed, "It is a pack saddle, as sure as my father is my father, and whoever has said or will say anything else must be drunk." "You lie like a rascally clown," returned Don Quixote, and lifting his pike, which he had never let out of his hand, he delivered such a blow at his head that, had not the officer dodged it, it would have stretched him at full length. The pike was shivered in pieces against the ground, and the rest of the officers, seeing their comrade assaulted, raised a shout, calling for help for the Holy Brotherhood. The landlord, who was of that fraternity, ran at once to fetch his staff of office and his sword, and ranged himself on the side of his comrades. The servants of Don Luis clustered round him, lest he should escape from them in the confusion. The barber, seeing the house turned upside down, once more laid hold of his pack-saddle, and Sancho did the same. Don Quixote drew his sword and charged the officers. Don Luis cried out to his servants to leave him alone and go and help Don Quixote, and Cardenio and Don Fernando, who were supporting him. The curate was shouting at the top of his voice, the landlady was screaming, her daughter was wailing, Maritornes was weeping, Dorothea was aghast, Luscinda terror-stricken, and Donna Clara in a faint. The barber cudgelled Sancho, and Sancho pommelled the barber. Don Luis gave one of his servants, who ventured to catch him by the arm to keep him from escaping, a cuff that bathed his teeth in blood. The judge took his part. Don Fernando had got one of the officers down and was belabouring him heartily. The landlord raised his voice again, calling for help for the Holy Brotherhood, so that the whole inn was nothing but cries, shouts, shrieks, confusion, terror, dismay, mishaps, sword cuts, fisticuffs, cudgellings, kicks, and bloodshed. And, in the midst of all this chaos, complication, and general entanglement, Don Quixote took it into his head that he had been plunged into the thick of the discord at Agramont's camp, and, in a voice that shook the inn like thunder, he cried out, "Hold all, let all sheathe their swords, let all be calm and attend to me as I value thy lives." All paused at his mighty voice, and he went on to say, "Did I not tell you, sirs, that this castle was enchanted, and that a legion or so of devils dwelt in it? In proof whereof I call upon you to behold with your very eyes how the discord of Agramont's camp has come hither, and been transferred into the midst of us. See how they fight, there for the sword, here for the horse, on that side for the eagle, on this for the helmet. We are all fighting, and all at cross purposes. Come then, you, señor judge, and you, señor curate, let the one represent King Agramont, and the other King Sobrino, and make peace among us. For, by God Almighty, it is a sorry business that so many persons of quality as we are should slay one another for such trifling cause." The officers, who did not understand Don Quixote's mode of speaking, and found themselves roughly handled by Don Fernando, Cardenio, and their companions, were not to be appeased. The barber was, however, for both his beard and his pack-saddle were the worse for the struggle. Sancho, like a good servant, obeyed the slightest word of his master, while the 4 servants of Don Luis kept quiet when they saw how little they gained by not being so. The landlord alone insisted upon it, that they must punish the insolence of this madman, who at every turn raised a disturbance in the inn. But at length the uproar was stilled for the present, the pack-saddle remained a caparison to the day of judgment, and the basin a helmet, and the inn a castle in Don Quixote's imagination. All having been now pacified and made friends by the persuasion of the judge and the curate, the servants of Don Luis began again to urge him to return with them at once, and while he was discussing the matter with them, the judge took counsel with Don Fernando, Cardenio, and the curate as to what he ought to do in the case, telling them how it stood, and what Don Luis had said to him. It was agreed at length that Don Fernando should tell the servants of Don Luis who he was, and that it was his desire that Don Luis should accompany him to Andalusia, where he would receive from the Marquis his brother the welcome his quality entitled him to, for otherwise it was easy to see from the determination of Don Luis that he would not return to his father at present, though they tore him to pieces. On learning the rank of Don Fernando, and the resolution of Don Luis, the four then settled it between themselves that three of them should return to tell his father how matters stood, and that the other should remain to wait upon Don Luis, and not to leave him until they came back for him, or his father's orders were known. Thus, by the authority of Agramant, and the wisdom of King Sobrino, all this complication of dispute was arranged. But the enemy of concord and hater of peace, feeling himself slighted and made a fool of, and seeing how little he had gained after having involved them all in such an elaborate entanglement, resolved to try his hand once more by stirring up fresh quarrels and disturbances. It came about in this way. The officers were pacified on learning the rank of those whom they had been engaged, and withdrew from the contest, considering that whatever the result might be, they were likely to get the worst of the battle. But one of them, the one who had been thrashed and kicked by Don Fernando, recollected that among some warrants he carried for the arrest of certain delinquents, he had one against Don Quixote, whom the Holy Brotherhood had ordered to be arrested for setting the galley slaves free, as Sancho had, with very good reason, apprehended. Suspecting how it was then, he wished to satisfy himself as to whether Don Quixote's features corresponded, and taking a parchment out of his bosom, he lit upon what he was in search of, and setting himself to read it deliberately, for he was not a quick reader, as he made out each word he fixed his eyes on Don Quixote, and went on comparing the description in the warrant with his face, and discovered that beyond all doubt he was the person described in it. As soon as he had satisfied himself, folding up the parchment, he took the warrant in his left hand, and with his right seized Don Quixote by the collar so tightly that he did not allow him to breathe, and shouted aloud, "Help, for the Holy Brotherhood, and that you may see I demand it in earnest, read this warrant, which says this highwayman is to be arrested." The curate took the warrant, and saw that what the officer said was true, and that it agreed with Don Quixote's appearance, who, on his part, when he found himself roughly handled by this rascally clown, worked up to the highest pitch of wrath, and all his joints creaking with rage, with both hands seized the officer by the throat with all his might, so that, had he not been helped by his comrades, he would have yielded up his life ere Don Quixote released his hold. The landlord, who had perforce to support his brother officers, ran at once to aid them. The landlady, when she saw her husband engaged in a fresh quarrel, lifted up her voice afresh, and its note was immediately caught up by Maritornes and her daughter, calling upon heaven and all present for help. And Sancho, seeing what was going on, exclaimed, "By the Lord, it is quite true what my master says about the enchantments of this castle, for it is impossible to live an hour in peace in it." Don Fernando parted the officer and Don Quixote, and to their mutual contentment made them relax the grips by which they held, the one the coat collar, the other the throat of his adversary. For all this, however, the officers did not cease to demand their prisoner and call on them to help, and deliver him overbound into their power, as was required for the service of the king and of the Holy Brotherhood, on whose behalf they again demanded aid and assistance, to effect the capture of this robber and footpad of the highways. Don Quixote smiled when he heard these words, and said very calmly, "Come now, base, ill-born brood, call ye it highway robbery to give freedom to those in bondage, to release the captives, to succour the miserable, to raise up the fallen, to relieve the needy? Infamous beings, who, by your vile grovelling intellects, deserve that heaven should not make known to you the virtue that lies in knight-errantry, or show you the sin and ignorance in which ye lie, when you refuse to respect the shadow, not to say the presence, of any knight-errant. Come now, band, not of officers, but of thieves, footpads with the licence of the Holy Brotherhood, tell me, who is the ignoramus who signed a warrant of arrest against such a knight as I am? Who was he that he did not know that knight-errants are independent of all jurisdictions, that their law is their sword, their charter their prowess, and their edicts their will? Who, I say again, was the fool that knows not that there are no letters patent of nobility that confer such privileges or exemptions as a knight-errant acquires the day he is dubbed a knight, and devotes himself to the arduous calling of chivalry? What knight-errant ever paid poll tax, duty, queen's pin money, king's dues, toll, or ferry? What tailor ever took payment of him for making his clothes? What Castilian that received him in his castle ever made him pay his shot? What king did not set him at his table? What damsel was not enamoured of him, and did not yield herself up wholly to his will and pleasure? And lastly, what knight-errant has there been, is there, or will there ever be in the world, not bold enough to give, single-handed, 400 cudgellings to 400 officers of the Holy Brotherhood, if they came in his way? End of Part 15. Chapters 44 and 45.